Hi maple lovers. In my own garden today, doing a video that will help you choose maples that really do like full sun. There's a sort of caveat to that really. I'm not saying if you live in the Sahara and you're going to put them in the middle of a desert that's going to be fine. Nor am I saying that, you know, if you live on the North Pole and there's full sun all day, that's fine. So just to be clear here, there's the USDA sort of system. You can look that up actually, or I might leave the reference in the comments below. And it sort of says what zone you're in. So I'm in a zone 8, which is the sort of fairly middle of the road kind of zone for maples. So, you know, we have to be specific. I also think that with these I'm showing you, you have to really think about when we say they like full sun, what do we mean by that? Yeah, sure, they like full sun, but it's other factors too that go with it. So the actual ambient temperature is going to be a factor, because we're talking about sort of evaporation from leaves here, as is, to be fair, how much wind there is. So without further ado, I'm teasing you with this one here. It's Shishikashira. Now, this ticks an awful lot of boxes for me. It's a lovely tree, extremely popular, and now relatively easy to get hold of. So if you have a look down here, it's got a lovely thick green stem, and this has been in this position on the south-facing wall the entire season. Now, there's a few things I think makes this really resistant to full sun, really, and wind, and heat actually. So this is why it does so well. So if I just zoom, well, go wide actually, and go really close to these little leaves, what you might see is where you've got some lovely new growth on here, is the new growth is quite curled over. So, I mean, I've never heard anyone comment on this before, but it seems to me it's almost like grass that lives by the sea or something, like marram grass. It's sort of curled over, and that's going to sort of protect that new growth quite well, really, from wind and evaporation generally. So again, a little adaptation that makes a difference. If you also compare that to the red wine behind, you can see that on the red wine, the lower leaves down here, which have exactly the same amount of sun as other ones, actually have done really well. But when you get to the top of the bush here, as you can see, I'm having trouble actually keeping everything in focus because it's blowing around. So even though that's just as much full sun as others, because it's actually been buffered by the wind, and then it's like it's on a big spring almost. It's going back and forth, that's going to get more dehydration. So again, I think when you're thinking about sun tolerance, it's actually dehydration we're talking about, and how much the plant can actually bring water to its extremities and at a rate that exceeds the rate it's losing it. So it's quite an interesting one. As I say, these lower leaves are looking really good. If you contrast that with Shishikashira over here, I can move it, and it's like it's got its own suspension or something. It just wobbles a bit and moves. So the same wind on both trees, and a totally different effect. So I think that's important, and it's interesting actually. I mean, in general, this is quite a sheltered wall. It does get a little breeze, but that's all part of it's all elements that go into this discussion. So moving on to what's behind, which is Shana. So again, a Shana is a typical sort of red dwarf maple, which is absolutely gorgeous, and it puts on a lot of foliage. It's like a bloodgood, but in miniature, and sort of piles on the foliage. It's actually what's called a witch's broom, because it was found many years ago actually growing on another tree. It's a sort of branch from another tree that's gone a bit crazy, and it's been cultivated. And what you can, and I do love, is so the new growth on Shana is just lovely. So even though this is a dwarf tree, it's not slow growing in the sense. It puts on a lot of growth, but it's not, unlike Mr. Red Wine over here, it's not all heading skywards. It's very compact and dense, which is lovely. So how's this done in the sun? Extremely well. And again, for me, it hardly moves. It sort of settles itself quite quickly. In fact, the whole tree sort of wobbles a little bit. It's quite strange, really. But it's got that solidarity about it. It's not going to get sort of gusted around in by the wind. But there's virtually no leaf damage whatsoever, which is quite amazing. In fact, I'd go as far as saying some of the inner leaves down there are really quite green. It's sort of saying, give me more sun. I can deal with it, sort of scenario. But absolute little winner. And just to point out here again, Shana is a witch's broom. It's a sort of genetic, it's a bit of a mutant really. And there we have a classic curled over centre finger here like that, which indicates just that. So that's quite interesting. So absolutely gorgeous tree. Grows quite quickly, then sort of slows down because it's so dense. So great patio plant for smaller areas. But yes, for a south-facing orientation, just absolutely fine. And before we leave Shana, just having a look again. Sorry about my shadow, but that's where it is. Again, you can see all the green that's there at the back. But I think that makes you look really interesting. I'll do another video, I think, soon about how you need some sun actually on these plants. If that was in a shady area, it would be extremely green, apart from the new growth in red, which would rapidly turn green. So I think it's important to get the most out of these trees. So moving on to one next door to it, is Cotonuito. What this says to me is quite interesting. I mean, there's a sort of heat tolerant or sun tolerant palmate leaf. We've got this one here, we've got another palmate there, and suddenly we've got this fella. He, you might think, would dry out very quickly with these long, spindly sort of leaves. Not at all, but perhaps that makes them kind of more wind resistant because the wind just sort of passes through it like bamboo or something. Again, it does actually wobble around more, but he's hardly affected at all by movements of the wind, which is amazing, really. But I do like this one, and again, the sun has given it a bit of colour. It does generate some interest. So absolutely rock solid tree this is, at least as again in my zone, in this particular environment. So really enjoying that. I think they're called linearly lobum leaves. These very, very long strap-like leaves are just gorgeous. And I've got other ones of these, and will certainly be on the lookout for more. If you watch some of my other videos actually of Kingston Lacey, they've got some lovely examples there as well, which like Villa Taranto, which I would certainly get if I could. So again, keeping the theme of heat tolerance, you can see, the sun is going down a little bit on this now because the afternoon is progressing. But this is Atropopyreum, just a good old-fashioned Atropopyreum, a classic red maple. Again, interesting because here we see the leaves going slightly orange because of the sunlight's effect on them, and that's absolutely fine. Again, it just adds a bit of interest. Lovely. But here on the extremities, these have got the same amount of light, but again, they just do get jostled around in the wind that little bit more, really. So it's just looking at all factors. It's certainly not been a hot summer here in the UK, so that's helped. But I would also say that last year was an absolute scorcher, and it did far less damage than people thought it would. Why? Because the wind can be shielded from, we can do something about it. Whereas that plus the scorching heat we have would be amazingly bad for these plants. I actually visited one of my favourite nurseries, and the polytunnels went over 50 degrees, but because there was no wind inside them and the sun was mitigated by the roof of the tunnels, these trees were absolutely fine actually, and perfectly saleable. So here we have another absolute firm favourite, which is Siriu. I almost forgot the name then, that's crazy. This is a brilliant tree. It's actually a weeper. It should be a weeper because it's a sort of cut lace leafy kind of lovely thing, but it's the one that doesn't do that. In fact, it's bizarrely, it grows straight upright. And I think once you get to know your maples, you kind of understand there are sort of common elements to these. They might go upright, they might weep, they might have lace leaves, they might have palmate leaves, they might have serrated leaves. So it's almost like these traits are mixed and matched, really. But this is one of my biggest trees in the ground. This would be twice as big as this now. It would be absolutely huge. And in Western Burt Arboretum in the UK, I've certainly walked underneath them. But what about sun tolerance? Just fantastic. I don't know what you'd have to do to this to kind of cause it serious harm. And it's interesting going out and about as well, because they are planted in quite exposed scenarios, and for good reason, because they just do really well. But I think you can see why. Again, it sort of bounces back. It doesn't blow around ridiculously, but the leaves actually do have the ability to kind of change their combination of chlorophyll, I would say. So they kind of brown off and go slightly red. So they're sort of like we do, exposed to the sun. My skin will adapt and turn brown. Obviously, we haven't had much this year, but as you can see, it's able to cope. It's able to adapt, and it's kind of it's niche, really. I mean, it makes sense, actually. I never thought this before, but if cereal grows so fast, it wouldn't be much good as a sort of genetic mutation, if you like, if it then sort of scorched itself to death when it outgrew everything else. So just an absolutely lovely tree. So I hope you find that interesting. I'm trying to best as I can explain that it is that combination of heat and wind and direct sunlight, and that you have to take kind of all three into account to understand how these can be. But you can certainly grow Japanese maples in direct sun without an issue in a whole range of, or in many parts of the world, basically. I would just say before I close as well that you see these sort of information, you see these on the internet, which is, Japanese maples must be grown in shade. And to be honest, it's kind of a bit lazy. Even some of the plant grows, they just sort of cut and paste off another website, a generic piece of information. And they're kind of just interested in selling you the plant without being experts, really. So it's always good to look at, sites perhaps like this on the web, and make your decision in a far more detailed way. So indeed, if any of you have got a position or a particular planting you're looking for, do drop a line in the comment and we can help with that. Sort of recommend some nice trees. You certainly don't have to just go to a local nursery necessarily and buy whatever they've got. There are excellent mail order companies both in the UK, in America most definitely, and all over really. So I think we should be picking the right tree for the right location. That's always my key message, and enjoying them in the location they want to be.